My name is Emily, and I was born the second of two sisters who shared the same face, the same blood, and yet lived lives as different as heaven and hell. We were twins, Amelia and I, but from the moment I took my first breath, I carried something that marked me as unworthy in my parents' eyes, a blemish, a swollen red mound that bloomed in the middle of my forehead. It was not merely a spot. It was a curse, a cruel imperfection that grew with me, magnified by the pitying looks of relatives and the sharp disdain of those who should have loved me most. Amelia was radiant. Her skin shone clear as porcelain, her smile could light up an entire hall, and her presence was celebrated as though she were a princess born into our wealthy dynasty. I, on the other hand, was hidden in the shadows. At family gatherings, she would descend the grand staircase in dresses woven from silk, while I was left behind in my room, staring at the wall, listening to the applause that followed her every step. Sometimes I pressed my forehead to the cold glass of my window, watching carriages and luxury cars pull up, the guests spilling out in glittering gowns and tuxedos. They never asked for me. No one ever noticed I wasn't there. Mother would enter my room only to scold me for existing. "Do you know how humiliating it is?" she hissed once, gripping my chin so tightly I thought she might crush it. "To have a daughter as ugly as you? Do you know what people would say if they saw you standing next to Amelia?" Her nails left little crescent on my skin, but the sting in her voice hurt more. Father was no kinder. To him, I was invisible, a ghost who consumed food and space but provided nothing in return. I remember the first time Amelia laughed at me in front of others. We were 8. I had followed her into the garden, desperate to spend time with her. She was surrounded by cousins, all of them playing a game with ribbons and kites. I tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Can I play too?" She turned, her perfect lips curling into a smile as sharp as glass. "Why don't you fly a kite on your forehead, Emily? It's already so big, it might reach the sky." The children burst into cruel laughter and I froze, rooted to the spot, my face burning. That was the moment I realized Amelia was not my refuge. She was my tormentor, and everyone adored her for it. Years passed, and my place in the family never changed. Amelia was the jewel. I was the flaw. She learned piano and violin, painted canvases that were displayed in our halls, and attended ballet recitals where mother and father sat proudly in the front row. I was left behind, instructed to scrub ink stains from my school blouse or iron linens for the maids. If I dared to protest, father's voice would thunder, "At least make yourself useful, since beauty and talent were wasted on you." But the cruelty did not stop at words. When Amelia turned 16, father gifted her a sapphire necklace passed down through generations of our family. That night, I crept into her room, hoping to admire it in secret, to touch something that symbolized love from our parents. Amelia caught me, and instead of shooing me gently, she yanked the necklace from her neck and held it above my head. "You'll never wear something like this, Emily, not in this lifetime. You don't deserve it." She let it drop onto the floor at my feet, then crushed it under her heel until the sapphire cracked. I stood there trembling as she smirked. The next morning, father raged at me for breaking Amelia's gift. I was punished, locked in my room without food for 2 days. Every memory of my youth is steeped in humiliation, and yet a part of me still yearned for their love. I kept hoping if I studied harder, if I proved myself intelligent, if I found some way to shine, they might finally see me. That hope shattered on the day of the infamous contract. I was 19 when father entrusted Amelia with presenting an important deal to foreign investors. She was nervous, though she would never admit it. That night, she sneaked into my room, asking if I could review the documents. I did, pouring hours into making sure every number, every clause was flawless. But when the meeting day came, Amelia intentionally swapped my polished draft with a ruined version filled with errors. I walked into the hall, offering the correct papers in trembling hands, only for Amelia to cry out, "Father, Emily tampered with my documents." Gasps filled the room. The investor stared at me with cold disdain. My father's face turned purple with rage. And my mother, she slapped me across the face, right there in front of everyone. "Enough of your jealous sabotage," she screamed. That night, they made their decision. I was stripped of my inheritance. My name struck from the family will. Father's voice echoed like a final verdict. From this day forward, you are no daughter of mine. Amelia will carry our legacy. You leave this house. Leave this family. It was raining when they forced me out. I still remember the feel of the wet gravel under my bare feet. The weight of my soaked dress clinging to my skin. The mansion loomed behind me, its golden lights glowing in the storm while I stood at the gates, trembling and unwanted. Amelia appeared at the window, her silhouette framed in luxury, and raised a glass of champagne to me before the curtains fell shut. That night, I swore to myself, if the world would not have me, I would carve a place for myself with my own hands. I would return not as the rejected, pitiful Emily they despised, but as something greater, stronger. 10 years later, I did. I left the city that night with rainwater drying stiff on the hem of my dress, and a single duffel bag that held more air than fabric. The taxi driver did not ask why a girl with a red welt on her cheek and a glassy stare wanted the airport. Perhaps he assumed a love story had ended or a bad decision had been made. It didn't matter. My life had finally slipped its old skin, and beneath it was something raw, shivering, and alive. I slept in plastic chairs under fluorescent bulbs while announcements tumbled over one another. In different languages, every face around me was a tiny universe. No one knew me. No one would judge the mountain on my forehead or the way my hands shook. When I counted the few bills I had, at dawn I bought a one-way ticket to a city whose name sounded like a promise. I boarded the plane, pressed my forehead against the cool window, and watched the mansion of my childhood shrink into a toy in my mind until it vanished. The city greeted me with grit and exhaust and sunlight that pierced like a spear. I rented a room the size of a wardrobe from a woman who stared at my scar for 2 seconds too long, and then, mercifully, never stared again. The room had a single window that showed a slice of sky and the top of a billboard. That changed every month, like a private calendar only I could read. I took the first job I could find, bussing tables at a restaurant where the floor never stopped trembling with footsteps, and the kitchen shouted in steam. In the walk-in refrigerator I cried only once, silently, compressing my sobs into the metal shelves until my lungs remembered how to breathe alone. I learned the rhythm of labor the way I had once learned the rhythm of humiliation by repetition. My hands became quick, then clever, then deft. I memorized the orders of regulars and the temper of the head chef, who spoke in insults but meant survival by them. When a customer left a folded napkin with a phone number on the table, I wiped it away without reading. I had learned from childhood that attention had teeth. At night I studied. A second-hand laptop hummed like a patient animal on my desk while I taught myself spreadsheets and basic accounting, then corporate structure, then contracts. Numbers were loyal. Clauses were blunt. Rules could be bent but not broken. I took a course on negotiation where the instructor said, when they try to make you small, become precise. Precision is bigger than bravado. I wrote that on a post-it and stuck it to the mirror right beneath my swelling scar. The scar changed with me. It healed slowly, then stubbornly. When I had saved enough, I walked into a clinic whose receptionist wore a smile so professional it had weathered hurricanes. The dermatologist examined me with clinical interest, not pity, and spoke about sebaceous hyperplasia and laser resurfacing and scar revision. The words were dry leaves at first. Then they became a bonfire. After 2 procedures and the passage of months, the mountain of my forehead settled into a valley, still there but softened, like a childhood rumor no one could quite remember. The first time I went to work without makeup, I did not feel pretty. I felt unarmed. It was stranger and far more dangerous. My manager at the restaurant noticed the way I solved problems. When the supplier delivered the wrong fish and the chef swore in 3 languages, I found a vendor who would swap it within 40 minutes and cut the price by 10%. If we guaranteed repeat orders. Who taught you that? The manager asked, trying to hide his surprise. I thought of Amelia's necklace shattered under her heel. No one, I said. I taught myself to want the right outcome, not the right apology. The manager introduced me to the owner. A woman with silver hair and a gaze that weighed and measured without malice. She needed help with her books. I offered it for a rate so low it bordered on charity, because I wanted the experience more than the money. Within 6 months, I had streamlined her inventory, renegotiated waste disposal, and built a simple dashboard that floated red numbers into green. "You're going to leave," she said, not unkindly. "You have the hands and the head of a builder." She wrote me a letter of recommendation that read like a door opening. I took a junior role at a small logistics firm whose reception sofa sagged in the middle like a well-worn secret. I was the youngest person in the office and the only woman in operations. The men wore jokes like armor. I wore silence like a blade. I learned roots and rates and the art of listening until people told me the one thing they hadn't intended to. I learned that a truck's idle time was money dissolving in the sun, that a warehouse's placement relative to a freeway was a prophecy, and that contracts could thread a needle so fine you didn't feel the stitch until you bled. In my 3rd year there, during a heat wave that made the city smell like melted rubber, a regional competitor went bankrupt. They had good clients, bad cash flow, and leased trucks with payments overdue by 4 cycles. The owner, a man who had always mispronounced my name on purpose, came to our office with tanned forearms and panic on his breath. Our CEO wanted to buy the contracts. I wanted to buy the company. I had no capital. What I had was a plan. I built the model in 2 nights. Drinking cold coffee and running scenarios until dawn. Acquire assets at pennies, assume liabilities selectively. Fold routes into our network. Convert drivers with signing bonuses, cut duplicative admin. Monetize idle yard space by subleasing to a construction firm that had been begging for a lot near the port. The 3rd sheet in the model was labeled soft factors. It included things that could not be bullet-pointed: dignity for drivers, consistent schedules, a hotline for emergencies that a human answered, not a machine. When I presented the model, the CEO frowned at the audacity and then at the elegance. "How do we pay?" he asked. "We don't," I said. "We use their debt, our reputation, and a vendor note. We give the owner a job. Pride is cheaper than equity. We acquired them in under 30 days. Integration was a storm. I walked into it with a compass and a raincoat and came out on the other side with a map. By the end of the year, revenue had doubled, margins widened. And the CEO started listening to me in the first 10 minutes of a meeting, not the last. "You don't look like a shark," he said with a baffled smile. "I'm not," I said. "Sharks circle. I swim to shore." I bought my first apartment at 24. It was too bright in the mornings, but the windows were mine. I put a plant by the sill that fought, then flourished, as if it were taking lessons from my bloodstream. On my 25th birthday, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my face for a long time. In the glass, I saw a woman I would have admired from across a room, not because she was beautiful, but because she was inevitable. The first letter from home arrived like a ghost, forwarded through an old school friend who wrote, "I found this in my mailbox, thought you should decide." The envelope bore my father's angular handwriting. Inside was a photocopy of a magazine cover with Amelia's face on it and the headline, "Heiress of the Year," in the corner. A smaller line, "Record quarter for Halden Group." Halden was our name, stamped across skyscrapers like a brand of daylight. I felt nothing. Not envy, not longing. Only the dry rustle of time turning a page. I folded the paper and put it in a drawer. Later that night, for the first time in years, I dreamed of the mansion's staircase and of steps that led upward to a door I did not open. At work, I learned how to open doors others pretended were walls. I negotiated fuel hedges before a spike that made competitors flinch. I partnered with a software startup to run route optimization that reduced deadhead miles by 23%. I won a government contract no one wanted because the paperwork painted the margins as thin. Then I found the clause that allowed rate adjustments tied to port delays, and turned thin into supple by predicting congestion correctly. When the CEO retired, the board brought in a seasoned executive with a pedigree like a sword. He looked at me as if he recognized the metal too. In our first meeting, he said, "You will leave and build your own thing." It's only a question of when, I said, when the equation balances in my favor. He nodded as if that were a prayer. It balanced on a Wednesday afternoon when the city smelled like impending rain. I had lunch with a venture capitalist who had once been a truck dispatcher and wore his success like a jacket he still wasn't sure he deserved. He listened without interrupting while I described a platform that treated small carriers like co-owners instead of replaceable limbs, a network that paid fairly and on time, that used predictive maintenance to keep trucks in service, that offered microinsurance to drivers who lived one breakdown away from catastrophe. You're building a republic, he said. Not a platform. He offered a seed check that would have made my younger self faint. I countered with terms that made him laugh out loud and then agree. I walked back to the office in a drizzle that felt like confetti. We called it Harbor and Spine. I chose the name because every city needs a harbor to welcome and a spine to stand. We started in a borrowed room with secondhand chairs and a mural painted by one of our engineers. After hours, a great blue line that unfurled like a river across the wall. In the first month, we signed for carriers. In the 6th, 40. In the 12th, 400. Our value proposition was not clever marketing. It was simply that we did what we said. We paid when we promised, answered calls at midnight, sent roadside assistance within 40 minutes, and treated delays like storms, not sins. Drivers told each other. Dispatchers told each other. The Republic grew. Growth has a sound, the layered hum of servers, the syncopated tap of keys, the laughter that erupts after 18 hours when a bug finally surrenders. I slept on the office couch more than once. I made mistakes. I hired a charismatic liar and fired him when the charisma wore off and the lies didn't. I missed a cousin's wedding in a city I had never returned to. I cried once in a bathroom so clean it felt sacrilegious, then splashed water on my face and returned to a meeting where I said no to a deal that would have doubled our revenue and halved our soul. 2 years in, Halden Group launched a logistics arm, Halden Freight, as if they could smell my footsteps from across the ocean. Their ad campaign used words we had used a year earlier, varnished and misapplied. Amelia appeared in glossy commercials wearing a hard hat in a warehouse that had never seen her soft shoes. We value the people who keep the world moving, she said to a camera that loved her. The first time I saw the ad play on a screen in an airport bar, I felt a sensation I had nearly forgotten, heat rising from the core of me, pressure building behind my ribs. I finished my tea and bought another billboard's worth of patience. We did not fight their campaign with our campaign. We fought it by out-executing them. When their trucks broke down, their drivers called us after their supervisor ignored them. We sent assistance anyway. When their contracts underpaid, we offered fair terms and added a clause that paid bonuses for on-time deliveries during holidays. When they forgot a driver's name, we learned his daughter's. We grew in the edges they neglected. We grew like ivy. The first time Halden's name showed up across from mine was on a bid for a multinational's distribution contract, 5-year term, 12 hubs, penalties that looked like bear traps. We won by offering modular commitments, building a risk-sharing mechanism, and promising a pilot into regions that we could expand only if KPIs justified it. The client's head of procurement, a woman with iron gray hair and a laugh like falling cutlery, sent me a single-line email. You didn't win because you were cheaper. You won because you were honest about not knowing everything and confident you'd learn. I stared at that sentence until my eyes blurred, then forwarded it to my team with a subject line that just said, with revenue came leverage. With leverage came acquisition offers and predatory smiles. I turned most of them down. I said yes to buying to warehouses at auctions where Halden bid as well. The first one we won because we found environmental liens they hadn't noticed and used them to lower the price, then fixed the issues ourselves for half of what any estimate predicted. The second one we won because the auctioneer mispronounced our name, and Halden's representative smirked at the wrong moment, and I recognized my childhood in his face, entitlement's blind spot. That night I walked alone through the echoing emptiness of our new building. The lights buzzed, dust floated in the high beams like lazy stars, and the concrete retained the day's heat. I lay down on the floor and pressed my ear to it. The building did not have a heartbeat yet, but I could feel it learning how. My first invitation home arrived in the form of a threat. A letter from Halden Group's legal department claimed we had violated their intellectual property by using trade secrets in our routing algorithms. The list of alleged secrets was so laughably generic that even their lawyers seemed bored. Still, they filed suit. I read the complaint with a steadiness that made my general counsel suspicious. "You're not angry?" she asked. "Oh, I am," I said, and felt a calm, precise joy. Anger is my favorite telescope. Discovery is a light the arrogant don't expect. We found emails that were clumsy in their ambition and sloppy in their concealment. We found notes from consultants who wrote flattery like invoices. We found a memo in which someone had written, "H and S is winning because they publicly treat drivers like owners. How do we mimic that cheaply?" I read it and felt a laugh rise in me that sounded like a crowbar prying open something old. We countersued. Their PR machine spun. We neither flinched nor preened. The court dismissed their suit. Ours settled with a statement so diplomatic it tasted like chalk. What they did not understand was that the point had never been to win a headline. It had been to walk into their field, look round, and measure the height of their fences. It was then that I made a decision that reshaped the horizon line of my life. I would buy Halden Group, not outright, not at once. I would do it the way a tide takes a coastline, in increments, in patience, in moon-pulled certainty. The board structure was complex. A fortress built over decades to protect a legacy that assumed it deserved protection. Family trusts held voting shares. External investors held liquidity. Banks held the debt. Subsidiaries held secrets that would take a lantern to illuminate. I hired a small team of people who knew how legacies cracked, a merger's lawyer, who had once dismantled an empire and kept the pieces from cutting anyone. A banker with a laugh that disguised a memory like a trapdoor. A statistician who could make numbers confess. We began by buying debt. Quietly, then less quietly, then boldly. Halden had expanded into areas it did not understand, and the market had punished them with higher interest on loans they had assumed would remain cheap forever. We purchased tranches from institutions happy to lighten their balance sheets. We bought from a family friend of my father's who would have recognized me if memory had a better nose. He did not. We structured covenants that allowed us to call in performance reviews at moments when their metrics would be soft. We waited. We watched inside the mansion I had left 10 years ago. The ceilings were still painted with cherubs who had never descended to help me. In the boardroom downtown, Amelia smiled in ways that made photographs glow. She was good on camera, better on stage, and terrible on paper. Halden Freight hemorrhaged cash while her Instagram gained followers. Their CFO, a man so thin he looked like a rumor, tried to prop up the numbers with cuts that looked efficient and felt like amputations. Drivers left. Contracts soured. A rumor began, then solidified. Halden was tired. The rumor was not true. They were not tired. They were stunned. The call came in late winter. A private equity firm that owned a substantial minority stake wanted out. They had bored of Amelia's parties and my father's thunderous certainty. They offered me a sliver first, a package small enough to deny later. I said yes. 3 months later, they offered me more. I said yes again. Information travels along fibers no one can map. Within a quarter, we had positioned ourselves such that a board seat would not be a favor but a fact. When I walked into the boardroom of Halden Group for the first time, the receptionist said, "Welcome, Ms. Hale." She misread the badge. Hale, not Halden. A single letter that made me nobody. I smiled. "Thank you," I said, and pressed my palm to the polished wood of the door as if it were the old banister I had never been allowed to touch for long inside. The table was glass, as if transparency could be forced by furniture. My father sat at the head, white-haired now, his jaw still set like a verdict. He looked at me and saw only a representative from an investment vehicle, not a daughter carrying a decade like a torch. Amelia sat to his right in a suit the color of champagne, her hair a perfect flag. Her eyes passed over me like I was a portrait of someone unimportant. The meeting proceeded. Losses were contextualized, risks minimized, successes inflated. I asked 2 questions, each surgical. After the second, my father looked at me as if I had squared a circle in front of him. "And you are?" he asked. I told him the name of the fund. He nodded and moved on. It was almost disappointing, almost. I did not correct his blindness, I used it. We pressed for operational audits tied to debt covenants we now controlled. The audits required disclosures that made the board squirm. We offered bridge financing for Halden freight at rates that would feel forgiving if targets were met and punitive if missed. They missed. We had the right to appoint an observer to their ops meetings. We appointed me. In those rooms, I watched middle managers fold themselves into pretzels to fit PowerPoint templates. I watched men who had never driven a truck talk about driver churn, as if a person could evaporate like steam. I watched Amelia present a culture initiative that involved branded jackets and a hashtag. "You will not fix a leak with a laminated slogan," I said once, almost kindly. She blinked as if I had spoken in Morse code. But here is the thing about revenge I did not know until it brushed my wrist. It is not a singular act. It is a weather system. It moves, it builds, it covers, it clears. The more nights I stayed up building my strategy, the less I thought about the slap across my face at 19. The more I sat in rooms where my father's certainty met my math, the less the old wound itched. I was not becoming hard. I was becoming exact. The day the fulcrum turned was not dramatic. It was a Monday. The skyline had been washed by a storm so thoroughly the buildings looked new. The bank that held Halden's primary credit facility called. Our friend in the credit department spoke carefully. A covenant had been breached. A waiver could be granted. New terms could be negotiated. New terms would need new leadership. The board convened an emergency meeting. I arrived early and stood by the window where the city glittered like a field of coins, tossed from heaven. My father entered last, his footsteps a metronome. The chair banged a gavel as if that could control time. They tried to install a fixer, a man who had once reorganized a grocery chain by turning aisles into spreadsheets. He spoke in case studies at a volume meant to reassure. I let him finish. Then I laid out a plan so clear even the paintings would have nodded. Spin off Halden Freight. Raise capital against our real estate portfolio. Renegotiate leases with purchase options. Shut down the vanity projects that ate money and produced press. Institute a driver profit-sharing program that would staunch attrition. Sell a minority stake of the consolidated logistics entity to a sovereign fund that wanted stable, boring returns and had no appetite for drama. Silence followed, the kind that makes or breaks. The chair asked, "And who runs this?" I said, "I do." My father laughed once, sharply. "And who are you," he said, "to believe you can carry our name?" I looked at him and at the girl in the mirror behind my eyes who had pressed her forehead to glass. To watch other people's lives. "Someone who already has," I said. "They did not vote that day. They tabled it. They circled." The fixer resigned within a week when he realized this was not his stage. The bank called again with terms that were friendlier to us than to Halden. Because banks prefer gravity to pride. The chair spoke with investors. Investors spoke with their spreadsheets. My plan gathered mass. And then Amelia made the mistake that wrote the last chapter of her reign. She authorized without full board approval a payout to a boutique agency run by a man she had once dated for brand rejuvenation tied to a campaign that would debut at a gala. The payout violated a threshold. The violation triggered a clause. The clause triggered our right to demand immediate leadership review. The review triggered what review panels always trigger when they encounter a storm in a silk dress. A search for an umbrella. I was standing there with a canopy as wide as winter. The vote was scheduled for a Friday. I ate breakfast alone that morning at a diner where the pancakes arrived hot enough to steam. I could not taste them. I walked to the headquarters building not because I needed the exercise, but because I needed to feel the city under my feet. In the lobby, the receptionist still called me Ms. Hale. The elevator ride took an hour in the way a heartbeat sometimes does inside the boardroom. The chairs looked like witnesses. My father did not look at me. Amelia did. Something in her eyes flickered, a match that had met wind. The chair read the motion. The discussion began, then ended, then began again, as if words could delay physics. The vote was taken. I watched hands rise and did not count aloud. I had counted them in my head for weeks. The motion passed. I was named interim CEO of Halden Group, with a mandate to execute the restructuring plan immediately. There is a difference between the moment a crown is placed and the moment a crown fits. The first is ceremony. The second is weight distribution. I left the room with my folder and my breath and my childhood trailing behind me like a ribbon. That finally loosened. My father said nothing. Amelia's mouth was a line that should have been a scream. In the hallway, the head of HR handed me a packet with codes and passwords and a speech template written in corporate euphemism. I threw the template away. The first speech I gave was to the drivers. We gathered them in 3 hubs and streamed to 9 more. I stood on a pallet in a warehouse that smelled like oil and resolve and said, I am not here to tell you what color your jackets will be. I am here to tell you that if this company survives, and it will be because you do. Profit sharing starts this quarter. Overtime will be paid. The hotline will be answered by a human. If a truck breaks down, someone will show up. If a manager ignores you, they will not be a manager for long. The applause was not thunder. It was a low, steady rain. It was the sound of belief returning to a building. The second speech I gave was to the press. I wore a suit the color of storm glass and did not smile for cameras, because cameras had never smiled for me. I said, Halden has made mistakes. We are making changes. We will not decorate those changes with adjectives. Reporters asked for drama. I handed the math. Stock tickers twitched. Emails poured in, some venom, some relief. All of them proof that a body that has been numb will ache when it wakes. The third speech I wrote but did not give because some sentences are not meant for microphones. It was addressed to a house with a staircase that had grown up with me and never noticed. It said, I am the shadow you taught to walk with a straight back. The mansion was not part of the company. It was the family home, held in a trust with clauses that had assumed the family would always be richer than the enemies it made. But wealth has momentum. Once mine began, it did not stop. 2 months into the restructuring, with Halden Freight spun into its own entity under our control and bleeding less, with the real estate portfolio providing the cash runway we needed, I approached the trustee. The trust could liquidate assets under specific conditions to satisfy estate obligations. The conditions had accrued quietly because taxes, unlike pride, cannot be intimidated. I made an offer to purchase the mansion at fair market value, plus a premium for sentiment, which is a polite word for history. The trustee was relieved. The deal closed on a Wednesday. I did not sleep that night. I loaded boxes in my apartment into a truck and drove alone to the house in the morning. When the gate swung open, the creak sounded like a throat clearing after a long silence. The drive was lined with trees that had grown a decade's worth of rings without me. The front door opened before I reached it. The housekeeper who had once slipped me biscuits through a pocket of kindness stood there, older and smaller. She looked at my face as if trying to place a melody. Then her eyes filled. Miss Emily, she said, and the house heard my name as if for the first time. I walked through rooms that had been my exile. The piano gleamed. The dining table stretched like a dare. The portraits stared down with their painted commitment to names. I climbed the staircase I had dreamed of until my calves burned, then stood at its top and looked down at the space that had once been a stage, on which I was not allowed to perform. The wallpaper had been changed in my absence. The light had not. It fell across the landing in a way that made dust look like snow. I called my father. He did not pick up. I called Amelia. She answered with a voice honed by PR and fear. What do you want? She said, skipping hello as if punctuation were beneath her. You have an hour, I said. You, father, and mother. Come to the house. They arrived together as if old theater demanded old blocking. My father stepped out of the car first, then my mother with a scarf that tried to be a shield. Then Amelia in a coat the color of victory. They saw me on the steps. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a gate in a windstorm. My father's face did not move. Amelia blinked in slow motion, the way a cat does before it strikes. What have you done? My father asked, each word cut from granite. I bought a house, I said. Our house, my mother whispered. Yes, I said. Exactly inside, in the hall whose floor had once burned my bare feet with embarrassment. I had set a table with a folder and 3 envelopes. My voice did not raise. It did not need to. You're trespassing, my father said, like a man who believes law is obedient to his surname. No, I said. You are. The title has my name on it. You will leave. My mother reached for a chair as if the wood would remember her. Emily, she said, and stuffed 20 years of disdain into 2 syllables that tried to be maternal. Please, this is not a misunderstanding, I said. No, it is the tail end of a long understanding. Amelia looked around as if cameras might be hiding. Why, she asked. A child's question dressed as an adult's. Because you taught me to fly kites, I wanted to say. And almost laughed at the memory she didn't know I'd kept. Instead, I said, because I could, I handed them the envelopes. Inside were documents, one a formal notice to vacate the premises, lawful and bland. One a letter from the trustee confirming the sale. One a check I did not need to write, but did, to cover relocation and a year's expenses. Not because I was generous, but because I am cruel in ways they would never understand. Cruelty that stabilizes is mercy by another name. My father tried to push the documents back into my hand as if paper could be returned like a dish. You will regret this, he said. Maybe, I said. But I regret other things more. There was a moment then, a small, fragile moment, when a sliver of the girl I had been pressed her face against a window inside me and watched them. I felt the urge to ask for an apology as if it would plug a hole in a dam. I let the urge pass. Apologies steal time when they come 20 years late. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, and I nodded to her. She nodded back. My mother's eyes filled with a calculation so old it was exhausted. Amelia stared at the staircase as if it were a person who might help her. You can't, she said, but her voice put a question mark at the end. I can, I said. And I did. They left, eventually. Pride does not pack quickly. The house swallowed their footsteps and returned to stillness. I walked through each room and opened windows even though it was cold, because some air needs to leave. In the music room, I lifted the piano lid and pressed one key. The note rose and then settled into the wood like a promise sitting down. That night, I slept in my childhood bed and did not dream. In the morning, sunlight poured across the floor. I stood in it and felt its heat. The house did not feel triumphant. It felt possible. Running the company was different in every way that mattered and in none that did. Meetings still required chairs. Trucks still required tires. People still required reasons. We executed the plan with the relentlessness of weather. The sovereign fund invested. The warehouses we had bought began to hum. The driver program reduced attrition by 30% in a quarter. Halden Freight, slimmed and sharpened, began to make money instead of eating it. The board tried to take credit. I let them. My father did not return to the boardroom. The chair sent me emails with more adjectives than necessary. I replied with numbers. I visited hubs. I rode along on routes that started when the city slept. I sat with a driver at a diner where the coffee tasted like courage, and listened to him talk about his son's asthma and the terror that a doctor's bill could end a career. We adjusted our health stipends. I watched a mechanic teach an apprentice how to listen to an engine with a stethoscope, no joke, and felt the same awe I had felt when I first learned how to hear a company breathe. On a Tuesday afternoon, the billboard outside my first apartment changed. I knew because I had asked the company to call me when it did. A ridiculous request that somehow felt like a ritual. The new ad showed a blue river unfurling. It was a tourism campaign for a country I had never seen. I laughed in my office until my assistant peered in as if humor were an unfamiliar visitor. I'm fine, I said, wiping my eyes. I'm just reading old handwriting. Do you want a neat moral? A sentence that ties bows around yours? I can give you a shape instead. It looks like a staircase and a harbor and a spine. It looks like a scar that becomes a story you can touch without flinching. It looks like a house where a woman stands in a doorway and says her own name aloud. Until the walls learn it sometimes. Late at night, I walk the halls with bare feet and let the cold of the marble remind me that tenderness can be sharp. I pause at the window where I once watched parties swell and recede, and I imagine Emily at 8, pressing her forehead to the glass. I do not tell her it will be okay. I tell her it will be real. There is a difference, and it is everything. Amelia sends messages occasionally, all of them composed by someone else. They are careful, circumscribed, soft. My mother mailed me a photograph of us as infants once, to faces so identical that no one had yet decided which deserved the better story. I placed it in a drawer with the magazine cover and the letter I never sent. My father writes nothing. Silence is the last empire he knows how to hold. I let him keep it. On the anniversary of the night it rained me out of my own life, I hosted a dinner, not a gala, not a press event. Just a long table lit by candles and occupied by people who had pulled me through storms with their hands and not their headlines. The silver-haired restaurant owner sat at my left, the former truck dispatcher, now investor, at my right. The head chef sent a dish from the old restaurant, a little joke plated like a jewel. We ate and told stories of calamities survived and errors owned, and risks that paid off like faith sometimes does. When the plates held only smears of memory, I stood and raised my glass and said the closest thing to a prayer I know, to the exactness of love. And then I slept, because victory is not a pose but a place where your spine can unclench. In the morning, I met with a young woman in our lobby who wore the expression of someone forcing herself to ask for a chance. She stared at my forehead for a heartbeat, then away, embarrassed by her own legacy of looking. I don't have the right background, she said, listing the wrong colleges and the right hunger. I listened until she was out of breath, then handed her a problem we needed solved. You don't need permission, I said. Only proof, she smiled, then steadied, then nodded. As she walked away, I felt a thread pull through time, stitching something closed that had been open in me for years. Every empire is a story someone tells about themselves, until the story becomes taller than the person. I am not interested in empires anymore. I am interested in buildings that can hold weather and people who can hold power, without squeezing it to death. I am interested in trucks that arrive on time and drivers who go home in time for dinner, and lights that turn on when you walk into a room and turn off when you leave. I am interested in a house that once knew only the weight of my absence, learning how to carry my presence without creaking. Do I forgive them? The question curls at the edge of any story like steam. Forgiveness is a city with many roads into it. I am building mine slowly, with bridges that do not collapse when the river rises. Some mornings I stand at one of those bridges and look across and think, not today. Some nights I walk halfway and sit with my feet dangling over the water and think, perhaps. What I know is that I am no longer building the house of my life from their blueprints. The beams are mine. The windows are mine. The door is open and closes when I say, and not a minute before, if fate has a sense of humor. It is this, the scar I carried like a brand taught me to notice what does not heal without help. I have made a company from that noticing. I have made a home from it. The girl at the window would not call this triumph. She would call it breathing. She would be right. And when the city sleeps and the trucks hum on highways like lullabies, and the house settles around me like a book that has finally found its ending, I sometimes walk to the piano and press one key. The note rises, pure and steady, and I think of kites and glass and rain, and the precise joy of walking into a room where you were once told to disappear, and deciding to stay. In the weeks after they left the house, the silence changed its temperature. At first it was cold, the kind you wrap a blanket around. Then it became warm, like a bath the body eases into without noticing when the shiver ended. I learned the hour when sunlight slipped through the library's high windows and turned the dust to constellations. I learned the sound 3 different doors made in the wind, the kitchen door a tired cough, the veranda door a whispered joke, the front door a statement, the day the front door made its statement, and then another. I was in the music room with the lid open, playing scales as if my fingers could inventory the notes I'd been owed. The door chime sounded once, then again. I let it ring a third time before I rose. There she stood, Amelia alone, no makeup that I could see. A plain coat and a plain expression that made her look more like me than she ever had. For a beat, we were two faces separated by 10,000 choices. I know it's not my right, she said, as if the sentence were a fragile instrument someone else had handed her. But I need to talk to you. I stepped aside. The rules of the house were mine. I didn't have to use them cruelly to prove they belonged to me. She hovered in the hall, eyes moving over the frames like a hungry person in a bakery. You didn't take the portraits down. I will, I said. But not before I've decided if I want the nails to remain in the kitchen. I poured water into glasses because coffee felt like a commitment and wine felt like a ceremony. She sat, then stood, then sat again, finally settling with her hands cupped around the glass as if it could warm her. Up close I could see the exhaustion that expensive creams can't lie about. She went for the throat of her purpose fast, as if delay would dissolve it. I'm pregnant, she said. I watched her face for the reflex. The way a person looks at you to measure your reaction before deciding if the truth was a good idea. What I saw instead was fear shaped like protectiveness. There are terrors that introduce themselves as love. Congratulations, I said. It was not sarcasm. It was a simple, unadorned word. Her eyes brightened and then steadied, the way a gauge flickers and finds its mark. I don't want anything from you, she said, which we both knew could not be entirely true. That's not why I came. She paused and swallowed as if the next words were heavy with edge. I keep thinking about what kind of story I'm handing my child. What kind of house they'll be born into. I know I have done things I can't edit with a good caption. You made choices, I said. You rehearsed them until they looked instinctive. You enjoyed the applause. Yes, she said, and the word did not fight. But I didn't see. No, that's a lie. I saw. I just didn't look for long. It hurt less to look away. We sat without speaking long enough for the house to breathe around us. When she finally raised her head, something stubborn in her had softened. I came because I thought, what if there were a world where you and I at least weren't at war? Not sisters, maybe not friends, but not enemies either. A ceasefire. I thought of the girl in the garden with ribbons knotted around her wrists like prizes, laughing at me as if I were a misprinted page. I thought of the sapphire under her heel. I thought of the rain driving me out like a dog from a porch and the 10 years that taught me hunger has better things to do than lick at a closed door. A ceasefire, I said. Is that a word from your agency? No, she said, the ghost of a smile touching her mouth. They prefer Rebrand, of course they do. She set the glass down and leaned in. You don't have to forgive me. You don't ever have to like me. But I need to become a different kind of person for someone other than myself. I came to say that to your face because faces matter. Maybe not to cameras, but to a child they will. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the way her fingers pressed prints into the condensation on the glass and vanish. I remember learning as a child that even the clearest pain is covered in evidence of touch. You can't see until light hits it right. It felt like that with us. You want me not to ruin you, I said at last, without accusation. Because what else could a ceasefire mean from a general who has learned she can win? I want, she said quietly. A chance at a different ending. The housekeeper's step echoed down the hall just then. A mercy that released the moment from having to be decisive. I stood. Come, I said. There's something I want to show you. We walked the corridor to a door that had been locked my entire childhood. It was my mother's dressing room, a shrine to silks and mirrors and the choreography of being seen. I had the key now. The room smelled faintly of perfume and old intent. In the top drawer of the vanity, tucked into a velvet pouch that had not been moved in 20 years, was the sapphire necklace, cracked and beautiful, a scar captured in stone. I placed it on the table between us. Do you remember? I asked. Her hand rose without permission, hovering above the gem. I was 16, she said. I didn't think seconds had consequences. They always do. Why did you keep it? She asked. To remember that perfection fractures and still shines. She looked from the stone to me. And in that tilt of her head I saw the ghost of us as infants, before the world picked teams. She wasn't crying. Neither was I. We stood there with a broken jewel and our broken ways, and not for the first time. I felt the inevitable tenderness that arrives when two people finally stop pretending that harm is a mystery. It wasn't forgiveness that slotted into place, it was comprehension. And comprehension is the only soil forgiveness can grow in without rotting. Keep it, I said. Give it to your child one day. Tell them the truth about it. The truth? She asked, a wry crack in her voice. That their mother was a cruel girl who learned to edit. That their mother was a girl who thought a stone could prove love, and learned later that it never could. She nodded. And we both listened for the sound a moment like that makes when it takes root. It is not loud. After she left, I walked the perimeter of the gardens until dusk made the hedges into soft monoliths. My phone hummed against my palm. Messages from the office about a European partner. A memo from legal, a calendar invite moved. I replied with thumbs that were steady, and when the housekeeper called me in for soup, I went. Because some victories are a table you come back to. Days made a new rhythm. Halden's stock stabilized, then climbed. Not like a dramatic rescue, but like a patient body healing the way it knows how. The sovereign fund sent to observers who smiled as if they had been told to adopt houseplants. I gave them numbers instead, and after a month they started asking better questions. We launched a scholarship for drivers' children to study anything but logistics if they wanted to. The applicants wrote essays that made even the cynical in my office fold napkins over their eyes. Then, the phone call arrived that people dread and pretend they don't. My father had collapsed at a charity luncheon while telling a story about the early years, the ones that grew taller each time he told them. The hospital wanted family permission to proceed with the procedure he had once declared beneath him, because only poor men consent to frailty. The nurse's voice was gentle, practiced. She had called sons like me who were daughters like me, and daughters like me who were supposed to be sons their entire career. I drove there alone. The hospital smelled like the inside of a new book and the end of one. In the corridor outside the room, my mother sat in a chair so rigid it looked punitive. She clutched a purse as if it were ballast. Amelia stood near the window, her hands crossed over a swell that had just begun to show to the world. When she saw me, she moved forward as if to touch my arm, then stopped, remembering the new grammar between us. Inside, my father lay with tubes sketching a constellation across his chest. Without his voice, he seemed smaller, a portrait of a monarch between crowns. His eyes flickered open, then held. I saw recognition, not of me as the daughter he had trained himself not to see, but of me as the fact he could not deny. Emily, he said. An old name pushed through a new humility. I'm here, I said. This time not as a declaration of conquest, but as an unembroidered truth. Do what they ask. He managed, or perhaps hoped, reverting to command even from a ship taken by weather. I already did, I said. It's underway. Silence settled. Machines sang their indifferent psalms. A doctor with kind hands explained. Papers were signed. Decisions made. Afterwards, in the hallway, my mother said quietly, "Thank you." And the two words bent under the weight of all the ones she had not said. I did not accept them. I did not reject them. I placed them on a high shelf inside me where I keep the things that might one day become useful. He lived. He returned home, not to the mansion which belonged to the woman he had trained to vanish, but to a smaller house with light that was less expensive and more honest. Sometimes, on Sundays, I visited with policy binders tucked under my arm like shields I pretended were gifts. We did not reconcile. We did not reenact. We made a language of updates and advice and long pauses punctured by a joke that refused to be born. He held the scholarship brochure in his lap as if it might explain me. He never asked for forgiveness. He would have known what to do with a sword. He had no use for a bridge. In summer, we hosted a picnic on the lawn for employees and families. The trees fretted their leaves in the breeze. Children ran in delirious, nonlinear patterns that reminded me the body is a story long before the mouth. I wore a cotton dress and no armor. A driver lifted his little girl so she could see a magician pull a scarf from an empty hand. Her laughter cracked the sky into more blue. I stood beside the housekeeper, who had hired 3 new women and a man who sang while he polished brass. She nudged me. You should go play, she said, nodding toward a cluster of children with kites clutched in fists like promises. I never learned, I said. Too many rooms to hide in. She walked me down the slope anyway and pressed a spool into my palm. The string warm from someone else's son. Run, she commanded, and in the kind tone of some women is the power to command empires, I ran. The kite lurched, then dipped, then rose with the kind of stubborn grace that makes you believe things without tongues can be. Forgiving, too. It soared above the house and the hedge and the ghosts of drafts meant for other lives. And on the grass below, my team and my people and my possible life looked up and cheered. Somewhere in the crowd, Amelia clapped, her belly a gentle vote for the future. Somewhere else, my father stood in a patch of shade and pretended not to watch. When the wind steadied, I braced the string in my fingers and looked at the sky until my eyes watered. The line hummed and I understood at last, with the deep comprehension that arrives not as a thought but as a posture, that revenge had never been the flight. Revenge had been learning how to run without looking over my shoulder to ask permission to move. On a night in early autumn, I found the photograph again, the one of two babies who wore the same face and had not decided which one deserved the warmer room. I carried it into the library and set it on the music stand. Then I played. Not scales, not a song I knew, but a line that felt like a road and another that felt like a stream and a third that felt like a spine. The house listened and did not correct me. When the last note rested its head on the wood, I spoke into the quiet. My name is Emily, I said, for the 1,001st time. Speaking now not to the walls or the ghosts or the machines that count us, but to the girl who had made me. I am here, later in bed, with the windows open to let in the world's breath. I thought of all the ways a story can end and how none of them are tidy. I thought of the cracked sapphire in Amelia's drawer and the kite burned by sun in a garage. Somewhere in the bills I still turn to see what's printed on the back and the people who do not need me to be anything but exact. I thought of my father sleeping in a smaller house wearing a heart that had learned a new beat, and my mother adjusting to rooms that do not echo her name. The mansion's bones shifted. The night delivered a train's far whistle, and somewhere a truck downshifted on a grade. And somewhere a woman in a diner counted tips and decided to keep going. And somewhere a child looked at a mother's scar and saw, not shame, but a map. When I slept, I dreamed for once not of rain or glass or stairs. I dreamed of a harbor lit by lamps made from stars and a long, straight road out of it and along that road, people carrying their own names home, neither asking permission nor demanding apology, just moving, steady and inevitable, into the lives they had built with hands that had once been told to stay small. In the morning I woke before the alarm to the kind of light that makes everything look like a beginning. The house breathed and I breathed with it. I put on shoes and walked the halls and ran a hand along the banister and stepped into a day that would ask for a dozen decisions and give me a dozen chances to be precise. And when I reached the front door, I paused, palm on the wood, listening for the old creak. The old statement. It spoke, as it always does, and this time the sentence it made sounded a lot like welcome. Winter settled like a hush over the estate, muffling even the sound of my own footsteps. The mansion, once echoing with voices that cut and ridiculed, now carried only the rustle of wind against its windows and the low crackle of fire I lit myself. Each morning, I rose before dawn, brewed my own coffee, and walked the length of the hall with bare feet pressing into carpets that had once seemed untouchable. There was power in simplicity, no servants bustling about, no parents barking orders, no sister posing for admiration. Only me, and the silence I had earned. In those cold months, I learned the architecture of solitude. I learned that marble, when warmed by sunlight, releases a faint mineral scent. I learned the rhythm of the grandfather clock in the east wing, its chimes marking not just time but patience. And I learned something about my own reflection in certain mirrors. I still saw the girl with the blemish, her forehead throbbing with shame. In others, I saw a woman who had crossed deserts of cruelty to arrive here, scar softened, spine unbroken. Business kept me tethered. Harbor and spine had merged with Halden Freight now, not as a hostile takeover but as an absorption. a bone knitting itself into a stronger skeleton. Reports came in: daily revenue climbing, attrition shrinking, new partnerships inked with signatures that would have once belonged to my father's handshake. The empire I had been denied was not just restored, it was rebuilt in my own image. One where contracts protected the smallest as fiercely as they protected the largest, and yet, the nights were long. I would stand at the highest balcony, looking over the city lights blinking in the distance, and wonder if victory always felt this hollow. I had achieved what I swore under storm and exile: to take back everything, to make them feel the sting of banishment. I had expelled them from this house, cut them from the company, turned their names from power into whispers. Still, a hunger remained, not for vengeance. I had feasted enough on that, but for meaning. It was Amelia who cracked the shell of that hunger. She came again in spring, her belly now round, her face stripped of glamour. She brought no entourage, no photographers, no PR gloss. Just herself and a tremor in her hands. "I thought I hated you," she confessed, standing in the doorway like a child denied entry to her own room. "All these years, I thought you were my enemy. But I was only afraid that if you rose, people would finally see how shallow my crown was. I was terrified you'd take the light away. And you did, but now I see the light was never mine to begin with." We sat in the garden, where new shoots pierced the soil like stubborn promises. For the first time, Amelia listened more than she spoke. She asked about the 10 years I had vanished, what cities I had lived in, what jobs I had taken, what nights I had cried into the rough wool of a blanket that smelled of strangers. She wept quietly when I told her about the rain-soaked night at the gates, about the taxi ride with no destination, about the first job where I scrubbed grease with hands that had once been adorned with pearls. And then she placed my hand on her belly, firm and warm. The child kicked beneath, a tiny thumb against my palm. I flinched not from fear but from the sudden, startling knowledge that the future was pressing back against me. "I want them to know you," Amelia whispered, "not as the villain our parents painted, not as the rival I made you, but as the woman who survived us all. I want my child to know the truth, that strength can come from scars, that beauty is not always given, sometimes it is built." I didn't answer right away. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Then I nodded. "If you are brave enough to tell that story, I will be brave enough to hear it from you." From that day, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but a truth shaped by honesty. She came often, helping me choose fabrics for the nursery she was preparing, inviting me to doctor's appointments, asking for advice she might once have mocked. Slowly, the sharp edge between us dulled into something less lethal, more complicated, two women bound by blood, scarred by history, yet tethered to the same pulse of legacy. The birth came on a stormy night, 10 years to the day since I had been cast out into rain. I stood beside Amelia in the hospital room, holding her hand as she cried out, sweat dripping into her eyes. And when the infant's first wail split the air, raw and pure, I felt a weight in my chest loosen. Amelia pressed the child into my arms, trembling. "Meet your aunt," she whispered. The baby's eyes fluttered open, wide and unknowing. In their gaze, I saw no judgment, no cruelty, no inheritance of disdain, only possibility. In that moment, I understood. Revenge had been the fuel, but legacy would be the fire that kept me warm. And for the first time, truly, I let myself believe that I was no longer the unwanted twin. I was Emily, whole, inevitable, and finally free. The baby in my arms was soft and impossibly small, a weight that felt like both a beginning and a redemption. Her skin smelled faintly of milk and something sweeter, like the promise of spring rain. She opened her eyes, blue-gray, unfixed, searching without knowing what she sought, and in that gaze I felt a shift inside me, as though some ancient lock had unlatched. For 10 years I had built my empire on steel and spite, each brick laid with precision, each decision a testament to survival. But here, in this sterile hospital room with monitors beeping and storm wind rattling the windows, I realized that no empire mattered more than the fragile heartbeat pressed against my chest. Amelia lay exhausted in the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead, her lips cracked but curved in a tired smile. "Emily," she whispered, voice hoarse but steady, "she needs you too." I may never be enough on my own. I looked down at the child again. The small fists curled like unopened buds. I thought of our childhood, the laughter directed at me, the necklace shattered under her heel, the nights spent outside, the warmth of family light. And then I thought of this child, innocent of all those cruelties. A new branch on a tree that had nearly rotted. "I'll be here," I said, softly but with the same conviction I had once used in boardrooms to seal billion-dollar deals. For her, for you. For what comes next, the months that followed were a quiet revolution. The mansion, long a place of bitterness, began to hum again, not with arrogance or shallow banquets, but with the gurgles of a baby, with lullabies hummed in the dim hours of dawn, with the gentle shuffle of Amelia's tired feet across polished floors. The housekeeper, who had seen it all, often stood in the doorway smiling, her eyes moist with something like gratitude. I took on the role of guardian as naturally as I had once taken on the role of conqueror. While Amelia recovered, I walked the child through the corridors, whispering stories into her tiny ear, stories not of castles and crowns, but of strength carved from rejection, of beauty born from resilience. I promised her that she would never be hidden, never be diminished, never be made to feel like her existence was an inconvenience. At the office, my team noticed a new softness in me. I was still sharp, still exact. But there were moments, glimpses, when I paused before delivering a cutting remark, when I chose patience over precision. I carried photos of my niece in my phone, and sometimes, in late-night meetings with exhausted analysts, I would slide the phone across the table and say, "Look at this. Isn't she perfect?" They would smile, and the tension in the room would break. For the first time, I realized power could be wielded not only through fear or awe, but through tenderness. My father, still weakened but stubbornly alive, heard the news of his granddaughter. He did not come at first. Pride wrapped him tight as an old coat, and perhaps he believed stepping into the mansion again would admit defeat. But one Sunday morning, as I sat on the veranda with the baby asleep against my chest, a car pulled up the drive. I recognized the gait before I saw his face, the same heavy, deliberate stride that had once made the ground quake with authority. He stopped at the foot of the steps, staring at me, at the child in my arms. His face was weathered now, lined not only by age but by the collapse of certainty. "She looks like you," he said finally, his voice cracking like old wood. "She looks like herself." I replied. We stood in silence, the years between us a canyon neither knew how to bridge. Finally, I rose and extended the child toward him. "Would you like to hold your granddaughter?" For a moment, I thought he would refuse. His jaw tightened, his eyes glistened with unfallen tears. But then his arms opened, hesitant, trembling. I placed her carefully in his embrace, and as he looked down, something broke inside him. He cradled her as though she were spun from glass, whispering words I couldn't hear. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine, and in them was not apology, not absolution, but recognition. Recognition that I was no longer the discarded twin, no longer the ghost of shame. I was the one who had carried the name forward when he had nearly lost it. The company flourished under my leadership. Our logistics empire stretched across continents now, rooted in the principles I had forged in exile: fairness, precision, dignity. Drivers sent me letters, sometimes with shaky handwriting, telling me how profit sharing had let them send their children to school, how paid overtime had kept food on their tables. One letter came from a man in his 60s who had driven trucks his whole life. He wrote, "No one ever remembered my name until now. Thank you, Miss Emily, for making me visible." I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, a reminder of why I had endured all the storms, but business victories, as intoxicating as they were, paled beside the victories at home. The child Isabella, named after our grandmother, grew fast, her laughter filling the halls where once only my sobs had echoed. She had Amelia's smile, but when she furrowed her brow, I saw myself. She followed me everywhere, her tiny footsteps pattering behind mine, her small hand reaching for mine with absolute trust. At night, when she asked for stories, I told her not of queens and castles, but of women who had survived storms, of travelers who had built new homes from ashes, of children who had been overlooked but grew into giants. She would fall asleep with her head on my shoulder and I would sit for hours, unwilling to let go. One evening, Amelia found me there, rocking Isabella slowly. She sat beside me, her eyes soft. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to," I said. "This isn't about debt. It's about choosing a different story for her than the one we were given." Tears slipped down Amelia's cheeks, silent but unashamed. "Do you ever wish things had been different for us?" I thought of our childhood again, of the cruelty, the division, the betrayal. Then I looked at Isabella, safe and loved in my arms. "If they had," I said, "maybe we wouldn't have learned how to fight. Maybe we wouldn't have learned how to endure. And maybe I wouldn't know now how to give her the life she deserves." Amelia leaned her head on my shoulder. And for the first time in our lives, we sat not as rivals, not as strangers, but as sisters. The years rolled forward, steady as tides. My father passed quietly one winter evening, his hand in mine. His last words a whisper, "You were always the stronger one." My mother, fragile without his shadow, softened in her final years. She spent her days with Isabella, reading her stories, baking simple cakes in the kitchen she had once deemed beneath her. When she passed, it was with Isabella clutching her hand, whispering, "I love you, Grandma." And I lived not as the unwanted twin, but as the matriarch of a family remade, as the leader of a company that bore scars like medals, as the guardian of a child who carried no burden of shame. The house that had once exiled me now stood as a sanctuary, its windows glowing warm in the night, its doors no longer creaking with rejection but opening wide to welcome. Sometimes, when the city lights blinked in the distance and Isabella's laughter echoed through the halls, I stood at the top of the staircase, the same place where Amelia had once descended in gowns. While I hid in shadows, I stood tall, my head unbowed, my name no longer a wound but a crown. "My name is Emily," I whispered into the silence, not as a reminder, not as a defiance, but as a truth carved deep into the bones of the house, into the fabric of the family, into the story that would live long after me. And this time, the walls did not echo back with emptiness. They whispered, warm and steady, as though they finally knew me. I was home. The seasons turned and the mansion learned to breathe again. Where once its halls had echoed with cruelty, they now carried laughter, footsteps, and the kind of conversations that stitched together a family instead of tearing it apart. Isabella grew into a spirited child, quick with her questions, stubborn in her beliefs. She would stand at the very top of the staircase I had once feared, hands on her hips, declaring herself queen of the house. I never told her to be quiet, never told her she didn't belong in that light. Instead, I clapped until her cheeks flushed with pride. At 7, she demanded to know the story of the scar on my forehead. I had hidden it well over the years, softened by time and careful hands. But she had eyes that noticed everything. "Aunt Emily," she said, poking her tiny finger toward it, "what happened here? Was it a battle scar? Were you a warrior?" I smiled and pulled her onto my lap. "Yes," I said after a pause. "It was a battle scar. I fought against people who didn't see my worth. And every day, I won by surviving." Her eyes widened, bright and odd. "Then I want a scar too," she announced. "So I can be strong like you." I pressed my forehead against hers, whispering, "No, my darling. You don't need scars to be strong. You already are. Your strength will come from knowing you are enough always." She carried that lesson into everything. At school, when other children teased her for her seriousness, she replied, "My aunt says I don't need to be pretty for you to like me, I just need to be myself." Her teachers often sent me notes saying she was bold, sometimes defiant, always unwilling to shrink. Each time I read those notes, I folded them into my heart like keepsakes. Amelia, too, transformed. Motherhood reshaped her in ways no crown or applause ever could. She apologized not in one grand speech, but in small gestures repeated until they became habit. She listened when Isabella cried instead of dismissing her. She shared credit at work instead of hoarding it. She admitted when she was wrong, though the words often stuck in her throat. It was not perfect, but it was progress. And I found myself watching her not with resentment, but with something like pride. Our mother never fully shed her old ways, but in her final years she softened like fabric worn thin by washing. She would sit in the garden with Isabella, telling her stories of flowers and birds, never of jewels or parties. One day, Isabella came running to me with a drawing of 3 women holding hands, their heads crowned not with tiaras but with stars. "This is us," she declared, "me, Mama, and you." I looked at the crooked lines, at the stars scrawled above our heads, and felt tears blur my vision. Perhaps this was what healing looked like, not erasing the past, but rewriting the ending so the next generation would know only light. Business continued to thrive. Harbor and Spine merged fully, with Halden became the backbone of trade across oceans. We pioneered green transport, electric fleets humming along highways where once only diesel growled. We gave scholarships not only to drivers' children but to anyone willing to learn, creating a cycle of opportunity that spread far beyond our walls. And when I was asked to speak at international forums, I did not boast of profits or growth. I spoke of dignity, of how a company's true measure lay in how it treated its smallest cogs. Once, standing before 1,000 CEOs, I told them I was cast out of my own home, left with nothing. What I built came not from riches but from hunger, not from privilege but from pain. If you wish to build something that lasts, don't ask yourself how much wealth you can take. Ask yourself how much hope you can give. The hall erupted in applause. But it was Isabella's voice from the front row that carried to me most clearly. "That's my aunt." The years folded like pages, and I watched Isabella grow. At 12, she insisted on shadowing me at the office, taking notes in a small leather journal. At 16, she launched a school project that connected local farmers to markets using our old routing software. At 18, she stood at the same staircase where I had once hidden, announcing to a house full of family and friends, "I will never let this house be a place of shame again." I stood beside her, my heart swelling until I thought it might break from joy. Sometimes, late at night, I wandered the halls alone, as I had done in my youth. But now the shadows no longer whispered my failures. Now they hummed with memories of resilience, of voices that had learned to sing instead of wound. I often found myself in the music room, the cracked sapphire necklace resting in a glass case atop the piano. I had not given it away. It remained there as a reminder: beauty can fracture and still shine. When Isabella asked about it, I told her the truth, not the bitter version, but the full one. "Once, your mother broke this necklace in anger. And once, I kept the pieces in pain. But now, we both keep it in remembrance of what we were and what we chose to become." She traced the crack with her finger and nodded solemnly. "It's still beautiful," she said. "Yes," I whispered. "So are we." In the end, my story was not one of exile or vengeance, though it began that way. It was a story of survival, of building an empire from ashes, of turning wounds into wisdom. It was a story of how one child, dismissed and discarded, returned not only to claim her place but to transform the place itself. "My name is Emily," I told myself often, standing at the windows where I had once pressed my forehead against cold glass. I was the unwanted twin. I became the unbreakable woman. And I will be remembered not for what I destroyed, but for what I built. The tide of my life had risen, fallen, and risen again. And as I watched Isabella laugh in the gardens, Amelia smiling beside her, I knew the tide had carried me exactly where I was meant to be: home, whole, eternal. The seasons turned, and the mansion learned to breathe again. Where once its halls had echoed with cruelty, they now carried laughter, footsteps, and the kind of conversations that stitched together a family instead of tearing it apart. Isabella grew into a spirited child, quick with her questions, stubborn in her beliefs. She would stand at the very top of the staircase I had once feared, hands on her hips, declaring herself queen of the house. I never told her to be quiet, never told her she didn't belong in that light. Instead, I clapped until her cheeks flushed with pride. At 7, she demanded to know the story of the scar on my forehead. I had hidden it well over the years, softened by time and careful hands. But she had eyes that noticed everything. "Aunt Emily," she said, poking her tiny finger toward it, "what happened here? Was it a battle scar? Were you a warrior?" I smiled and pulled her onto my lap. "Yes," I said after a pause. "It was a battle scar. I fought against people who didn't see my worth. And every day, I won by surviving. Her eyes widened, bright and odd. Then I want a scar too, she announced. So I can be strong like you. I pressed my forehead against hers, whispering, no, my darling. You don't need scars to be strong. You already are. Your strength will come from knowing you are enough always. She carried that lesson into everything. At school, when other children teased her for her seriousness, she replied, my aunt says I don't need to be pretty for you to like me, I just need to be myself. Her teachers often sent me notes saying she was bold, sometimes defiant, always unwilling to shrink. Each time I read those notes, I folded them into my heart like keepsakes. Amelia, too, transformed. Motherhood reshaped her in ways no crown or applause ever could. She apologized not in one grand speech, but in small gestures repeated until they became habit. She listened when Isabella cried instead of dismissing her. She shared credit at work instead of hoarding it. She admitted when she was wrong, though the words often stuck in her throat. It was not perfect, but it was progress. And I found myself watching her not with resentment, but with something like pride. Our mother never fully shed her old ways, but in her final years she softened like fabric worn thin by washing. She would sit in the garden with Isabella, telling her stories of flowers and birds, never of jewels or parties. One day, Isabella came running to me with a drawing of 3 women holding hands, their heads crowned not with tiaras but with stars. This is us, she declared, me, Mama, and you. I looked at the crooked lines, at the stars scrawled above our heads, and felt tears blur my vision. Perhaps this was what healing looked like, not erasing the past, but rewriting the ending so the next generation would know only light. Business continued to thrive. Harbor and Spine merged fully, with Halden became the backbone of trade across oceans. We pioneered green transport, electric fleets humming along highways where once only diesel growled. We gave scholarships not only to drivers' children but to anyone willing to learn, creating a cycle of opportunity that spread far beyond our walls. And when I was asked to speak at international forums, I did not boast of profits or growth. I spoke of dignity, of how a company's true measure lay in how it treated its smallest cogs. Once, standing before 1,000 CEOs, I told them I was cast out of my own home, left with nothing. What I built came not from riches but from hunger, not from privilege but from pain. If you wish to build something that lasts, don't ask yourself how much wealth you can take. Ask yourself how much hope you can give. The hall erupted in applause. But it was Isabella's voice from the front row that carried to me most clearly. That's my aunt. The years folded like pages, and I watched Isabella grow. At 12, she insisted on shadowing me at the office, taking notes in a small leather journal. At 16, she launched a school project that connected local farmers to markets using our old routing software. At 18, she stood at the same staircase where I had once hidden, announcing to a house full of family and friends, I will never let this house be a place of shame again. I stood beside her, my heart swelling until I thought it might break from joy. Sometimes, late at night, I wandered the halls alone, as I had done in my youth, but now the shadows no longer whispered my failures. Now they hummed with memories of resilience, of voices that had learned to sing instead of wound. I often found myself in the music room, the cracked sapphire necklace resting in a glass case atop the piano. I had not given it away. It remained there as a reminder beauty can fracture and still shine. When Isabella asked about it, I told her the truth, not the bitter version, but the full one. Once, your mother broke this necklace in anger, and once, I kept the pieces in pain. But now, we both keep it in remembrance of what we were and what we chose to become. She traced the crack with her finger and nodded solemnly. It's still beautiful, she said. Yes, I whispered. So are we. In the end, my story was not one of exile or vengeance, though it began that way. It was a story of survival, of building an empire from ashes, of turning wounds into wisdom. It was a story of how one child, dismissed and discarded, returned not only to claim her place but to transform the place itself. My name is Emily, I told myself often, standing at the windows where I had once pressed my forehead against cold glass. I was the unwanted twin. I became the unbreakable woman. And I will be remembered not for what I destroyed, but for what I built. The tide of my life had risen, fallen, and risen again. And as I watched Isabella laugh in the gardens, Amelia smiling beside her, I knew the tide had carried me exactly where I was meant to be, home, whole, eternal.